So hi, everybody. Julie Ponesse here. Whew, this is an odd time, I think, to say the least, a scary time. As a Canadian, our Prime Minister has just invoked an act that has never before been used in Canada. And when you live in a democracy and things get tough, surreal, dystopian even, it seems like it's exactly the time, not to sort of let our fears run away from us, but rather to sort of try to maintain some composure, talk to each other, work out some of these ideas and see if we can figure out as a people what's going on and how to move forward in the way that best preserves what's unique about Canada and being a Canadian. As I'm sure many of you know, I work as the Pandemic Ethics Scholar for the Democracy Fund, and that's a registered civil liberties charity in Canada. We have an education arm and a legal arm. I'm on the education side of things, but today I have the pleasure of speaking with an amazing member of our legal team, lawyer Alan Honner. So Alan, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm hoping you can shed a little light on this kind of odd legal situation and help us. Me too. I'm an academic, but the legal intricacies of what's just happened to us, I think, are pretty obscure. They're obscure to me and obscure to many. So I'm hoping you can sort of talk us through some of that. So to begin, on Monday, Prime Minister Trudeau announced at a press conference that he was going to be invoking this Emergencies Act. And among other things, it seems like this is going to put some limitations on the civil liberties that are guaranteed to people in Canada in virtue of our Constitution and our charter rights in particular. So it seems like as a civil liberties charity, we have quite a lot to talk about. So thanks, Alan, so much for joining us today. Can you tell us, in your view, what does this mean for Canadians, and how does this Emergencies Act interfere with, interface with, relate to the charter in Canada?
Sure, absolutely. So, as you said, Justin Trudeau has invoked the Emergencies Act, and that is a very extraordinary thing to do. It hasn't been done ever. So what it means for Canadians is that their government now has increased powers. And if you look at the preamble to the Emergencies Act, what it says is that, in times of emergency, there will be these increased powers available to the government, which might not be appropriate in normal times. And the question of how it affects Canadians really depends on how the government is going to use those powers. And we've had a glimpse of that starting yesterday when they released these orders which are made pursuant to the Act about how they're going to exercise certain powers which are available to them for the particular type of emergency that they proclaimed.
Mm-hmm. So this law, Emergencies Act, came into effect in 1988. As you said, it's never been used before. This is new. This is unprecedented. And the language, I was looking last night at this Emergencies Act, and the language of emergency, I guess unsurprisingly, appears throughout it. But it raises the question, I think, well, what counts as an emergency that would be protected by or necessitating the invocation of this act? And I'm just reading from a little bit of it here, and it says the Emergencies Act is a federal law that can be used by the federal government in the event of a national emergency. Okay, and then I think sort of reasonable reader says, well, what's that? What's in a national emergency, right? And it goes on to define that as an urgent, temporary, and critical situation. Okay, urgent, temporary, critical. So let's keep that in mind and ask, well, are we in that, right? That seriously endangers the health and safety of Canadians, or that seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. So there's a lot going on there. But first, what do you think about this language that it has to be a national emergency that's urgent, temporary, and critical? Do you think we're in that now?
I don't think that there's evidence to support that we're in that type of emergency.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Ponesse, you just pointed out this definition of a national emergency, and you can see that it really has so many parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But that's really, in a way, that's only one side of it. There are more parts to it. Because if you read this act, you'll see that there are a number of different types of emergencies which are listed in it. There are emergencies related to war. There are international emergencies. There are public welfare emergencies. And then there's the specific type of emergency that the Trudeau government just invoked, and that's called a public order emergency.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you pointed out, a public order emergency is a national emergency, but it's more than that, and it has a definition. And the definition, and I'm just sort of looking at the act here, is.
And is that defined, the public order emergency is defined in the Emergencies Act itself? So people listening to this could go and look it up?
They can go look it up. It's defined in section 16 of the Act, and it means an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada, and that is so serious as to be a national emergency. So part one, it's an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada. And what are those threats? To find out what those are, you actually have to look at a different act. And the act you have to look at is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act. And that act lists, it defines these threats. I don't want to go through all of them in exact detail.
Give us some examples if you can. So we have it. Sure. I was wondering this when I read it. I thought, well, what is a public order emergency? What does it mean to threaten the security of Canada as a nation, right?
Right. So I think what I can do for you is I can boil these different types of threats down. So on the one hand, you have this category of threats, which I would call espionage or sabotage. Another type of threat would be hostile foreign activity. A third type of threat would be serious acts of violence or threats of violence, which are motivated by religion or by politics or by ideology. And then the fourth category of threats can really be boiled down to sedition or insurrection. So what the government has to show is, on the one hand, that at least one of these categories of threats is out there. And then if they can show that, then they have to go and say, well, it's a national emergency. And there are so many parts to this test that I don't think they can possibly meet the threshold based on what they've told us and what many of us have observed.
So the threat has to be unique in kind and in severity, if I understand you correctly. So it has to be a threat of a particular kind. So undermining what it is that keeps a country together in some sense. But then it can't just be that. It also has to have reached a threshold of seriousness. So presumably, if I'm understanding correctly, if you had a minor act of insurrection, that would not pass this test. Or can you have a minor act of insurrection? I don't know, maybe by definition, that's not possible.
I think you have to ask some unsuccessful political activists.
Yeah, but the point you're making, it seems to be that this is quite significant, and that's why we don't see this act in play very often, because you need a pretty significant event that it would respond to.
Well, that's right. So let's maybe just take a minute to think it over. So let's say, and I think what the government has been saying up until this point, that the threat to the security of Canada has to do with serious acts of violence or threats of violence against persons or property that are motivated by politics or ideology. I think that's the main premise that they have. They might also be saying, well, it's sabotage, but let's put aside evidentiary arguments for now. Let's presume that they could satisfy it. Mm-hmm. Well, fine. Is it a national emergency? And if it is a national emergency, it's going to have to satisfy one of these two criteria. So it's going to be a situation which seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians, and is the sort of situation which can't be handled by the provinces.
Mm-hmm.
So are we in that situation? I don't think so. There's another situation it could be too. It could be, it could mean that let's presume that they can prove that there are these serious violent acts or serious violent threats, or that there's sabotage. Then they would still have to prove it's a national emergency. And the other way they can do that is to show that it seriously threatens the ability of the government to preserve sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. And that there's no other law that can effectively deal with the situation. So again, so many parts here.
Yeah.
Can they satisfy that? And why don't we have these laws which can effectively deal with the situation, which we see now in Ottawa and in other places around the country?
It seems, from my presumably limited, academic perspective, it seems to me like there's been a big jump from I was in Ottawa for a few days. You were in Ottawa, I think, and you've been to Windsor. You've been on the ground in these places, right? And my experience certainly was that there was nothing that would constitute any kind of emergency. There are inconveniences for sure, no doubt. Businesses are closed and streets are blocked and there's noise of various kinds, but it doesn't sound like inconveniences are what the Emergency Act is in existence to address, right? So it seems like we've gone from a large, granted, perhaps inconvenient protest to invoking the most, the strictest limitation on civil liberties that's possible in Canada. So, what kind of additional powers does this act entitle the government of Canada to do? What could they possibly do to citizens?
Well, they can't do anything they want to do. I don't think I would go so far as to say that this is as bad as it can get, right? Because there are limits to their powers. Earlier, you asked me if the charter still applies, and I didn't answer that, but let me answer it now. Yes, the charter still applies. And the preamble to the Act even goes so far as to mention that the charter applies. It doesn't have to say that, because we know the charter would apply anyway, but the drafters of this Act have decided that it was important to say that the charter still applied. So people still have their fundamental rights in Section 2, rights to freedom of expression, rights to freedom of peaceful assembly. They have their, they have their due process rights, starting at 7.
What's the butt that's hanging out there?
But okay, so what happens though is that
it's a good question, right? Because
it's a great question. I think it's a very important question.
Well, that this language of the charter still applies, but we have this Emergency Act. That to me is confusing, odd, but interesting language. So I'm so curious about what the practical upshot of that looks like. So in what sense? If the charter applies, does that mean something like we still have our full set of charter rights? Or
I think part of this is that the charter is sort of a confusing document. And I think as a country, we're starting to understand it a little bit more. But when you look at the first section of the charter, it does have that caveat, and it says that these rights are subject to reasonable limits, right. And those limits are limits which are prescribed by law and which can be reasonably demonstrated in a free and democratic country. So in other words, to make that a little bit simpler, and usually the way it presents in courts is that you have these rights, but sometimes when there is a compelling state interest, those rights are limited. And what I think we're going to see here is that the government has certain expanded powers, and those expanded powers are going to limit our charter rights to some extent. And let me jump ahead and say this. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If we have a true emergency, which requires the government to exercise powers which would ordinarily be inappropriate. But do we have that type of emergency now? I don't think we do. I know I told you that. I don't think the evidence is there for it. But what we're going to see is that some of our rights are going to be limited. And that is going to be in relation to the specific emergency they invoked and the powers that are available under that specific emergency.
We've certainly heard a lot about government overreach over the last couple of years, arguably, but increasingly more lately. And when I was reading through this Emergencies Act last night, I thought, is this a good law at all? Should we have such an act? If our Constitution already has this proviso, would we call it, that charter rights are guaranteed within these reasonable limits, then do we need to have a law that articulates when they should be limited, right? And I asked you this before and you said, no, I think the Emergencies Act is a good law, but it's just not being applied appropriately now. Right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The Emergencies Act is a good law, but it's meant to be invoked in very narrow and extraordinary circumstances, in times of war, in times of natural disaster, in times of insurrection. One of the weaknesses to the Act is that it can be abused, right? And if we look at this particular emergency that the government has just declared, a public order emergency, the government can invoke it if they have to consult with the provinces, but let's say they consult with the provinces and their consultations are not binding. They can invoke this type of emergency on a standard of reasonable grounds. And that is a pretty low standard. That is the standard that people get arrested for. Now, there are some checks and balances in the Act. They have to go before Parliament, but until they do that, a certain amount of damage can be done.
It's worrisome, isn't it? I mean, I've heard from a number of people who are supportive of the Emergencies Act. And when you look into their explanation for why they support it, a lot of them are saying things like, well, I'm just so sick of the protests. I'm so tired of the blockades. It's so annoying. Why don't the truckers just get back to work and leave Ottawa and leave us alone? Those kinds of things. But as I think you've explained well to us, the Emergencies Act is not an appropriate response to annoyance or inconvenience, right? The threshold for it to be invoked in the first place has to be higher than that. But now that it's been invoked, there's a possibility of fairly far-reaching powers from the government. And I wonder, what can you tell us about I kind of hate to use the language of fear, but what can you tell us about what average Canadians should be afraid of? Should we be worried that we can just be arrested now without the regular kind of due process that's in place? Should we be worried that our bank accounts can be seized if it's shown that we are providing charitable donations to organizations that the government doesn't approve of? What are the consequences for average Canadians, whether they're involved directly in the protests or not?
Well, the consequences for average Canadians is that they won't be able to do all the things that they were otherwise able to do in relation to some of these protests.
Okay.
Now, some of it is not completely clear, right? But let me give you an example of one type of Canadian who might be impacted by this. And these are the tow truck drivers. And we've all heard rumors about the tow truck drivers that they don't want to tow these trucks in Ottawa.
Right.
I don't know exactly what their reasons are. Maybe it's because they support these truckers in their acts of civil disobedience, or maybe it's because they don't want to lose customers. I'm not sure. But what the one of the powers available under the Act when the government proclaims a public order emergency is that they can essentially conscript people to provide services to them that they say are essential. And this is an important part. If you don't provide those services, you can be criminally charged. That's one way in which I think some Canadians will be affected. Now, other Canadians will be affected because there are restrictions on assemblies. And it's pretty vague, but essentially what the government is saying is that there are restrictions on assemblies which might lead or reasonably be believed to lead to a breach of the peace. And if you attend one of those, there are potentially consequences. One of the consequences is that you might have your bank account frozen.
Right now, we've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we've seen tickets being handed out to truckers themselves for certain charges, but we've not seen any tickets handed out to non-truckers. Is that right?
Well, I don't know everything that's been going on, right? If you're, I think the truckers have been, they've been ticketed because they're doing things like blocking streets.
Right.
You're not allowed to do that. That, every municipality
at any point
has a bylaw that says you will not block a street. But I think what we have to keep in mind here is that there are two types of things which are happening at these protests. On the one hand, we have people who are coming out and they're showing their support for these truckers and they're waving their flags and they are doing nothing wrong. They are engaging in protected activities. They are expressing themselves. They are assembling, and they don't appear to be breaking any laws. On the other hand, you have some truck drivers who are, certainly breaching bylaws and may potentially be breaking some criminal laws. And they're doing this, as far as I can see, out of civil disobedience, right? And they're saying we're tired of we're tired of our rights being taken away, and we're going to park our trucks here. And if you don't like it, come and arrest us. But why haven't we arrested them? If they are breaking laws, the police can arrest them. They have that power under the criminal code. If the police see somebody breaking the law, they can arrest them without a warrant. So why do we need these extraordinary measures under the Emergencies Act?
Well, that is one of the interesting questions, isn't it? I mean, is the invocation of the Emergencies Act justified given that there wasn't a more gradual progression and escalation in police response? And arguably, and I'm not saying I would sort of justify or support this, because I do think that there's space for peaceful civil disobedience, maybe not just space for, but it's an important mechanism for our democracy, peaceful civil disobedience. But anyway, if it can be shown that the police could have removed all of the trucks by simply arresting the truck drivers and removing the trucks themselves somehow, then the Emergencies Act would presumably be clearly not justified.
That's right. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Is this emergency, does it exceed the capacity or the authority of the province to deal with it? Or is it the type that can't be effectively dealt with under any other law in Canada? And, in both cases, there are criminal laws here. Now, they might even say that, well, we can arrest them, but we can't tow their trucks. I'm not sure that's true. If you arrest someone, you can get they can get search warrants and they can get assistance orders and they can compel people to help tow these trucks. It's not clear to me at all why they had to invoke the Emergencies Act when we have other laws which will address this type of situation.
It certainly seems like there's a lot of work that has been done by lawyers to get us to this point and that will need to be done moving forward. What is the Democracy Fund doing on the legal side in the face of this Emergencies Act? And what do you anticipate the Democracy Fund will be doing in the coming days and weeks?
So what we've been doing up until now is we have been to places like Windsor and Toronto and Ontario, as you mentioned, and we've had lawyers on the ground there, and they have been just trying to make sure that people know their rights. That they know their charter rights to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly, but also that they know their rights to due process if they're engaged in peaceful acts of civil disobedience. We have also been in court. We have made we've made submissions on the Ambassador Bridge injunction. And now that I bring that up, Dr. Ponesse, let me point out what we probably all know, but the Ambassador Bridge injunction was granted. The police cleared out that protest.
Okay, can you back us up a little bit for those who don't know about this? So what is an injunction?
Sure. So an injunction is a court order, and it's a court order saying you have to do or you have to stop doing something. And in this particular case, there was an automobile association who asked the Superior Court of Justice to issue an injunction stopping these blockades at the Ambassador Bridge. That injunction was granted. And that injunction, it gave the police power to arrest people who were blocking the bridge. Now, as far as I know, the police were completely successful in removing those protesters. And I believe the Ambassador Bridge it's either open now or there's no reason why it shouldn't be open.
So the question aside, whether or not that injunction should have been granted in the first place, your argument is, if I understand you correctly, is that given that the injunction did occur and that it did seem to have effect at dissolving the blockade in Windsor, makes us wonder, why did we get to this place on Monday where we now have this Emergencies Act in place?
Exactly. It shows that the police can deal with these problems. So why do we need this extraordinary measure of proclaiming a public order emergency?
Are you sympathetic to this argument that we're losing millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in goods traveling across the Ambassador Bridge? Are you sympathetic to that? I mean, I know Doug Ford has mentioned that several times in support of Trudeau's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act, but is that a good reason, right, for him to sort of turn over decision-making power to the federal government, that we're losing money?
Well, I think that's an important consideration, that we're losing money. And I'm not suggesting to anyone that we have charter rights which will extend to the point where we can block bridges for international trade. And people who are blocking those bridges are engaged in acts of civil disobedience. And, sometimes there can be consequences for that. People who are engaged in those acts hope to bring about political change, but there could be consequences. But to answer your question, I think this is something that the provinces could have dealt with on their own, or it could have been dealt with by the criminal code. I do not see why we had to invoke the Emergencies Act. With particular respect to Doug Ford, I'm not sure whether or not he endorsed the proclamation of an emergency. And as I pointed out earlier, the federal government will be required to consult with the provinces, but they're not actually required to listen to what they say.
Get their approval or something. Right?
Exactly.
There's sort of a feeling of a dystopian head in the sand quality to all of this, right? We've had a number of provinces, 5 maybe, but a number have made plans to lift their mandates already. Countries all over the world are doing the same thing. That's what these protests in Canada are about, right? I mean, as opposed to moving to this Emergencies Act situation, the federal government could have chosen to lift the mandates, to make a plan to lift the mandates. I mean, the Liberal and the NDP MPs have just voted down a plan to lift them. I mean, not even lifting them, but just a plan to lift them. And no member of the government has offered to meet with the protesters in order to hear their concerns. What do you think that says about the state of our democracy in Canada right now?
Well, I think what it says is that we have a government which is entrenched in a position,
Mhm.
and they are not willing to lift these mandates at the border.
Mhm.
And the reason they don't want to do it, I think, is because they do not want to lose face. They don't want the truckers to be able to say that, we were successful here. So what you really have is two sides which were entrenched. You have the truckers who were entrenched, and you have the government which is entrenched. But frankly, the government should have known better.
By that, you mean they should have known we would have gotten here?
I think what they should have known that they were acting in a way which was increasingly dividing Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
And and many people have pointed this out, but the actions of the federal government are, which have led to this proclamation of an emergency, are largely responsible for this mess we see ourselves in now.
This mess. I mean, you're a lawyer, I'm an academic, and then there are politicians, there are law enforcement people, but what's the average Canadian supposed to do about this? I know so many people are sitting back in disbelief, and when you see this all over social media, I think we hear it in our private conversations with people, you see it even in mainstream media. People just feeling like, what is going on? I was just reading a couple of articles from, I think one was the New York Post, and I forget the other one, American Publications this morning, just saying, what's going on in Canada? Like, are we going to face this kind of, government overreach in the States if we're not careful? I mean, it's a cautionary tale. It's a surreal one. What are we supposed to do when we kind of wake up out of this fog, when we come to terms with the fact that no, this has actually happened? But as a Canadian citizen, what are our options? What can we do moving forward?
And we're very dependent on our members of parliament in this situation.
Mm.
The average Canadian can talk about how displeased they are with the current situation, and they can notify their MP about how displeased they are. They can write to their MP, or better yet, ask for a meeting with their MP, tell them about how unhappy they are with the Emergencies Act.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some mechanisms for MPs to respond.
And by that, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So, on the one hand, when a public order emergency is declared, within 7 sitting days, it has to go before Parliament, and they can debate it and they can revoke it. But there's also a mechanism under Section 59 of the Act. And what that section says is that if you can get 10 senators to sign a motion saying they want to revoke this act, and if they file that with the Speaker of the House, or alternatively, 20 members of the House can sign a motion and file it with the Speaker of their House, then this motion has to be debated within 3 sitting days, and there can be a vote on it, and it can be revoked. And so what this basically is, there's a mechanism in there to accelerate the revocation of this act, or this emergency, rather.
So this is not a done deal in some sense. It's important for Canadians to understand that we still have representative government. We still live in a democracy, which means rule of the people, and that we can't sort of complain about what's happening to us if we haven't voiced our concerns to the people who are supposed to represent us, who are our MPs and then our MPPs, right? And I think you've given us really good reasons why it's important for us to do that, and then also the specific mechanisms that allow us to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any last thoughts?
Well, I guess my last thought would be based on something you just said. I think we have every right to be upset, even if we don't go and complain to our MPPs, or our MPs in this case, because they should be looking at the law, and they should take an honest look at it And regardless of whether or not they agree with these protests or if they disagree, they should say, no, this is not a national emergency. Justin Trudeau, you have not met the test. We're not going to let you do this. Even liberal MPs should stand up and they should say no to Justin Trudeau. You have gone too far. This is completely unwarranted.
We don't live in a dictatorship, not yet anyway, and we certainly don't have the political infrastructure that supports that, right? We still live in a democracy. We still have the rights to voice our opinion, but we have to put pressure on the people who are representing us politically. We're starting to see that in the House, don't you think? I think we're seeing more lively, robust debate than we have seen in a long time, and we're seeing people standing up to Justin Trudeau and Cynthia Freeland. And I think there's some comfort in that, but they must still feel that they have a threshold of public support, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing, I'm assuming. And so it's so important for us to talk about these things. Alan, thank you so much for shedding. I learned so much today, and I hope that people watching learned a lot. And if you have more questions, if you want to check out what the Democracy Fund is doing, you can check out our Instagram page or our Twitter page, or our website, thedemocracyfund.ca. So thanks so much, everyone.